So with that radical overhaul of the UK's approach to defence, what will it mean for NATO, the war in Ukraine and the AUKUS agreement? Dr. Malcolm Davis is a senior analyst in defence strategy and capability at ASPI, and he joins me now. Good to have you with us, Dr. Malcolm Davis. Now, so we've seen the UK raising its defence budget, pledging to increase the size of its nuclear sub-fleet, and this also comes alongside NATO's push for member states to raise defence spending to 3.5% of GDP. So, plain speaking, what are the UK and its European allies preparing for?
They're preparing for war with Russia, essentially. I think what the concern is that Russia will be allowed to win in Ukraine, probably as a result of the Trump administration walking away from supporting Ukraine, leaving it far less capable of defending itself against Russian attacks. So Russia wins in Ukraine, it rebuilds and regroups its military capabilities, and then pivots and turns its attention onto NATO's eastern frontier. And I don't think anyone's talking about a massive invasion of NATO by Russia. I think what we're talking about is Russia essentially attacking a NATO state such as Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania to create a crisis whereby they can then use nuclear intimidation of NATO to force NATO to back down. What Putin wants is to dictate the terms of NATO's capitulation in Eastern and Central Europe through generating just such a military crisis. And that's why you're seeing NATO member states now dramatically increasing their defence spending, not just 3.5%, but some of them are going up to 5% of GDP. And I think because they recognise they're in a pre-war period.
Will Russia be seeing this as a very serious message from NATO member states and the UK?
Look, I think Putin is determined to press ahead. He sees Ukraine merely as the opening act in a wider war. His goal, as I said, is to force NATO to capitulate, to destroy NATO's credibility as a military alliance, and ultimately to impose a Russian sphere of influence across Eastern and Central Europe. I don't think he'll be necessarily deterred by this move on the part of NATO states. And so therefore it's really vital that the NATO states get ready for war sometime within this decade.
As far as the ramping up of defense budgets are concerned, this would be music to Donald Trump's ears, would it not? Because this is what he's been calling for months. And of course, this is what Pete Hegseth has been re-emphasizing at the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I disagreed with the way that the Trump administration went about this in terms of their relationship with Europe, but it has had the beneficial outcome of forcing the Europeans to open their eyes and realize the dangers that they're in, and so having to realize that they do actually have to look after their own security. In terms of the Indo-Pacific and Pete Hegseth's comments at the Shangri-La Dialogue, I think he's making the same point in regards to China. There is a very real prospect that China could make a military move against Taiwan within this decade. I think the difference between Europe and the Indo-Pacific is for the United States is that the United States is making it very clear that it will support its allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, but it expects those allies and partners to contribute equally. And so that's why you have Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth calling on Australia to lift its defence spending to 3.5% GDP as soon as possible.
Yes, we'll get to Australia in a bit, but I'm curious to find out what this means for Ukraine. Will Ukraine be seeing this as a boost from a morale point of view, but also from a material point of view to see that NATO member states are ramping up the defence budget as what the UK is doing?
Well, it largely depends on how the US plays the Ukraine situation. If these peace talks in Istanbul fail, and they will fail because Putin is not interested in peace in any way, shape or form, then I think that what you will see probably is the US walk away from any efforts towards a peace deal. That could include then withdrawing military support for Ukraine and intelligence sharing. That would then leave Ukraine dependent on Europe to provide military assistance. And if the Europeans are frantically preparing themselves for war against Russia, then they may not have the capacity then to support Ukraine as well. So it would then leave Ukraine in a difficult situation. They'd have to rely on what they can get from Europe as well as their own military industrial capacity. that may not be sufficient in the end to hold off the Russians.
Yes. And as far as Britain's plans to increase the size of its nuclear-powered submarine fleet, what will this mean for AUKUS?
Look, I think it's a good move. I think it reinforces the importance of the UK's efforts towards what's known as SSN AUKUS, which is the future Royal Navy's nuclear submarine that we will also get as part of the AUKUS deal. So with that UK commitment to building up their submarine fleet to now 12 nuclear submarines, in addition to their ballistic missile submarines, then I think that it bodes well for AUKUS in the sense that we are then better placed to be confident that the UK will be in a position to support the AUKUS Pillar 1 arrangement for us to get nuclear submarines.
And might what the UK is doing force the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, to perhaps change his tact a little bit, given what Pete Hegseth had called for Australia, as you mentioned earlier, to raise defence spending, but to 100 billion, that is a lot. But do you think the Prime Minister might move to raise that as a percentage of GDP? Because the current tracking is for it to be 2.33% over the next 8 years.
Exactly, and that's too little too late. I think that the vast consensus across Australia's strategic policy community, including from my colleagues at ASPI, is that we are calling for defence spending of between 3 and 3.5% GDP as soon as possible as a floor. And that can't be in 10 years' time. It's got to be within a year or two. Now, that's a big challenge economically for the Prime Minister. He's gone to the election and won the election on the basis of cost of living issues, housing prices, healthcare, education, all of those important things. But the most important duty of any government is the defence of the country. And we are now in a pre-war period where we are facing the most challenging strategic circumstances since the end of the Second World War. So the Prime Minister has a duty and an obligation to ensure that we are adequately defended. That will mean that he does need to think about increasing defence spending beyond what is currently planned for, as you noted, 2.33% of GDP by 2033. Whether he goes to 3 or whether he goes to 3.5, I think will be really down to what is the strategic need, but also how he responds to the very likelihood of increasing pressure from the Trump administration, particularly when he goes to meet Donald Trump later this month.
Okay, Dr. Malcolm Davis, really good to get your analysis today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.